Ecclesiastes chapter 11. And I'm just going to read the first verse. Ecclesiastes chapter 11, verse 1. Cast your bread upon the waters, for you will find it after many days. In this scripture text tonight, Solomon takes us to the banks of the mighty Nile River. Each year during the rainy season, the Nile overflows its banks, inundating thousands of square miles of rich, fertile farmland. And in ancient times, as these floodwaters began to recede down to about a depth of 10 to 12 inches, the Egyptian farmers would wade out through those waters, casting their seeds or casting their bread upon the waters. And the farmers would then lead their oxen and goats out into the waters to stir up the mud and the silt. And as the waters continued to recede, the seeds would then come to rest down in that rich, fertile silt. And in time, the seeds would take root, and they would grow into healthy crops of grain, and the farmers would reap a rich, abundant harvest. Now listen again to Solomon's words here in Ecclesiastes 11:1 and see if they don't make more sense in light of what I've just told you. Cast your bread upon the waters, for after many days you will find it. As we're going to see in tonight's message, this verse isn't simply teaching us an ancient agricultural lesson from the Egyptian farmers. It's a lesson about life, especially the Christian life. It's a lesson about faith, and about risk-taking, and about generosity. And I believe it is a challenging message to all of us as we begin this new year. First of all, let's consider the precept. We find this precept in the first part of the verse. Cast your bread upon the waters. Cast your bread upon the waters. Now, I want you to imagine with me, if you will, it is the spring of 2018. And it's time for the farmers in this area to start getting their crops into ground. And while all the other farmers are out in their fields plowing and disking up the soil to prepare the ground to plant their crops, there's this one lone farmer in our area who's decided he's going to try a different way, a different method. Instead of plowing and disking up the soil, he has decided he's going to wait for the heavy spring rains to flood his fields. And so one day you and I are driving up and down Long Ridge Road or Jordan Thicket Road, and we see that farmer out there making his way across his flooded fields wearing hip waders, broadcasting his seed as he goes on top of the water. Now what do you suppose we would think about that farmer? We'd think he's gone crazy. And no doubt he would be the butt of many jokes of the other area farmers, wouldn't it? Now I'll tell you that example to make a point. In the Christian life, we do things differently than the world. Our lives confuse and confound the wisdom of the world. Remember what Isaiah said about God in regards to this? Isaiah 55 verses 8 and 9. For my thoughts are not your thoughts, nor are your ways my ways, says the Lord. For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts. And so God's precept of casting your bread upon the waters makes absolutely no sense from a worldly standpoint. But it is a precept that you and I as Christians should heed and obey. You remember after the disciples had spent all night fishing and hadn't caught a single thing. Jesus told them to cast their nets on the other side of the boat. And soon their net was so full of fish it almost sank the boat. Now, Jesus' command didn't make any sense to the disciples. I mean, what's the big difference about not catching fish on one side of the boat and then catching fish on the other side of the boat? That doesn't make a lot of sense, does it? But they just obeyed what Jesus told them to do. And soon they reaped a bountiful harvest of fish. And the same thing is true of this precept we're reading here tonight in Ecclesiastes 11:1. You notice God doesn't command us to cast our bread or cast our seed upon the land, which would seem to be the most logical place one would cast his seed, doesn't it? God commands us to cast our bread or to cast our seeds upon the waters, a place where it seems that there would be no hope of receiving any kind of return. And that is the point of this precept. This precept demands faith and trust on our part. Faith and trust in God for the results, not faith and trust in ourselves. And when Solomon says, cast your bread upon the water, that word cast literally means to sow generously. Hold nothing back. The Apostle Paul says it this way in 2 Corinthians 9:6. But I say, he who sows sparingly will also reap sparingly, and he who sows bountifully will also reap bountifully. That's the way things work in God's economy. The more you give, the more you receive in return. The more generous you are, the more you experience God's generosity in return. Now, let's consider 3 practical ways that you and I can carry out this precept of casting our bread upon the waters in this new year. One thing that you and I can do is keep casting our bread of kindness. Keep casting your bread of kindness. Kindness and Christian living go together like a hand and a glove. Ephesians 4 verse 32 says, be kind to one another, tender-hearted, forgiving one another, even as God in Christ forgave you. In Romans 12:10, Paul says, be kindly affectionate to one another with brotherly love, in honor, giving preference to one another. In Colossians 3:12, Paul writes, therefore, as the elect of God, holy and beloved, put on tender mercies, kindness, humility, meekness, and long-suffering. And then in the love chapter, 1 Corinthians 13, verse 4, Paul says, love suffers long and is kind. Remember I said, kindness and Christian living go together like a hand and a glove. You know, despite his busy schedule during the Civil War, President Lincoln often visited wounded soldiers in the hospital. And on one occasion, Lincoln saw a young soldier who was lying on his deathbed. Moved with compassion, President Lincoln asked the young soldier if there was anything that he could do for him. Barely conscious, that young soldier didn't even recognize that it was the president who was talking to him. And the young man began to dictate a letter to President Lincoln, as Lincoln wrote. The letter read, my dearest mother, I was badly hurt while doing my duty, and I will not recover. Don't sorrow too much for me. May God bless you and Father. Kiss Mary and John for me. Well, the young man was too weak to dictate any further. And so President Lincoln signed the letter for him, and then he addressed this postscript, written for your son by Abraham Lincoln. Asking if he could see the brief letter, the young man was astonished to discover just who it was that had shown him this act of kindness. He said, are you really our president? The young man said. Yes, I am, came Lincoln's soft response. Now, is there anything else I can do for you, young man? The young soldier said, Mr. President, would you please hold my hand? And so President Lincoln gently took the soldier's hand, and he sat by his bedside, offering prayers and words of encouragement until that young man departed from this earthly life. You know, Lord willing, God is going to afford you and me many opportunities to sow seeds of kindness this year. And the greatest depth of kindness is to show it towards those who maybe are the least deserving, or those from whom we expect to receive nothing in return. What greater kindness can there be than to do that? You remember in this morning's message, I challenged all of us to raise the bar in our Christian life this year. Well, this is one area that we can do that. Let's raise the bar. Let's step up our game this year by sowing seeds of kindness everywhere we go towards everyone that we meet. Now, something else we can do is keep casting our bread of persistent prayers. In Luke 18, verse 1, it says, Then Jesus told his disciples a parable to show them that they should always pray and not give up. I've shared this illustration with you before, but it's one that's certainly worth hearing again. For many years, a gold prospector in California out in the 1800s dug day by day in hopes of striking it rich, but he never did. And over the course of time, his wife and his children left him. And with little to show for years of effort, the man threw his shovel down on the ground one day, and he never dug again. He died a poor and lonely man. Well, years later, a gold nugget worth hundreds of thousands of dollars was unearthed just 3 feet away from where that man had thrown his shovel down. If only he hadn't stopped. How many of us have prayed and prayed and prayed for something, and after a while we just gave up, thinking that God wasn't going to answer our prayers? How many times have we given up when perhaps if we had just prayed one more month, or one more week, or one more day, or even just one more time, we would have received what we had been praying for? This year, keep casting the seeds of your persistent prayers. If you've been praying for that lost son or that lost daughter to come to Jesus Christ, or one of your other lost relatives to come to Jesus Christ, keep casting your seeds of persistent prayer. If you've been praying for that prodigal son or prodigal daughter of yours who once knew Christ and who was in church all the time, but now they never are, if you've been praying for them to come to their senses and come back to the Lord, keep casting your seeds of persistent prayer. If you've been praying that the Lord would send a revival upon Christian Hope Church of Christ, keep casting your seeds of prayer. If you've been praying that the Lord would open up a door of opportunity for you to have a new job, or for you to have a new place of service in His kingdom, then keep casting your seeds of persistent prayer. You know, this year, why don't we just get serious about what Jesus has taught us to do in the Gospels? And that is to keep on praying and not give up. Keep casting those seeds of prayer until we see God's answers. And then something else we can do this year is keep casting your bread of godly influence. In 1 Peter chapter 3, verses 1 and 2, Peter writes, Wives, in the same way be submissive to your husbands, so that if any of them do not believe the word, they may be won over without words by the behavior of their wives, when they see the purity and reverence of your lives. When I was ministering at Wilkinson Church of Christ, I saw the promise of these verses fulfilled in the lives of 5 ladies in our church. For many years, these 5 wives came to church by themselves. They sat by themselves in the worship service because their husbands stayed home. They never darkened the doors of the church building. And while all 5 of these wives invited their husbands to come to church along with them, they never nagged them about it. Instead, they set the example in their own lives by being faithful to the Lord. And do you know what happened? Over the course of time, all 5 of those husbands were sitting right there beside their wife in church every Lord's Day. Don't ever underestimate the power of your godly influence on the lives of other people. When your life is over, you may not leave much behind in the way of money or material things. But if the life of just one person was eternally changed by your godly influence, then you will not have lived your life in vain. So keep casting the bread of your godly influence. Well, that's the precept. It's not very long. Cast your bread upon the waters. Keep casting your bread of kindness. Keep casting your bread of persistent prayer. Keep casting your bread of godly influence. And that brings us to the promise in the latter part of the verse. Look at verse 1 again. He said, cast your bread upon the waters. There's the precept. Now here's the promise. For you will find it after many days. Charles Haddon Spurgeon explains this verse this way. He said, we must not expect to see an immediate reward for all the good we do. Nor must we always confine our efforts to places and persons which seem likely to yield us a recompense for our labors. We must realize that nowhere shall our labor be in vain in the Lord. It is our task to cast our bread upon the waters. It remains with God to fulfill the promise. God says you will find it. He will not let His promise fail. After many days, says the Scriptures, and in many instances those days run into months and years, and yet the Word stands true, God will keep His promise. When we do as God commands us to do, we don't always see immediate results or rewards. And this is why the Christian life demands patience, and perseverance, and persistence from us. When we cast the bread of kindness, we may not always see results or rewards of our kindness for a long, long time. But God promises that in time we will. When we cast the bread of persistent prayer, we may not see answers to our prayers for weeks or months or sometimes even years. But God promises that in time we will. When we cast the bread of our godly influence, we may not see any visible impact that our life makes on the life of someone else for a long, long time. But God promises that in time we will. There are 2 important truths that we need to learn about this promise that God makes in this verse. Truth number 1, God will always reward us, but in His time. God will always reward us, but in His time. Notice again what Solomon says in verse 1. Cast your bread upon the waters, for you will find it when? After many days. After many days. That phrase tells us there's usually a waiting period. From the time when you and I cast our bread or sow our seeds in life, and the time we reap a harvest or reward from sowing those seeds. There is a period of waiting that we typically go through. And God promises that the reward will come, but it will come in His time and not ours. Paul says it this way in Galatians 6:9. Let us not become weary in doing good, for at the proper time we will reap a harvest if we do not give up. The late A.B. Simpson explained it this way. I believe the toils and prayers of 20 years ago are not lost. We may not see the results of our labor and sacrifice immediately, but in due time they will issue into beauty and glory. Now listen carefully to what he says next. The love you give, the forgiveness you show, The patience and forbearance that grace your life will surely produce much fruit. The friend you long to bring to Christ may refuse to be reconciled to Him. His heart may seem to be very hard, and your prayers and efforts may appear to be lost, but they're not. They will come back to you 100-fold. Perhaps long after you have even forgotten them. Give God time. The result is working themselves out slowly but surely. There must be seed time in summer before the autumn reaping. Now here's the second truth about this promise. And that is God's rewards will always exceed our expectations. Jesus says in Luke 6 verse 38, "Give and it will be given to you, a good measure, pressed down and shaken together, running over, will be poured into your lap. For with the measure you use, it will be measured to you." You remember that passage in Matthew 19 when Jesus' disciples were struggling over what their reward was going to be because they had sacrificed everything to follow Jesus? Beginning in verse 27 of Matthew 19, we read, "And Peter answered and said to him, See, we have left all and followed you. Therefore, what shall we have? So Jesus said to them, Assuredly I say to you, that in the regeneration, when the Son of Man sits on the throne of His glory, you who have followed me will also sit on 12 thrones, judging the 12 tribes of Israel. And everyone who has left houses or brothers or sisters or father or mother or wife or children or lands for my name's sake shall receive 100-fold and inherit eternal life. But many who are first will be last, and the last first." Now what's that saying? It's telling us that you and I may not see any fruits or rewards for most of the things that we do in the Christian life while we're here. We may never hear that thank you. We may never receive that pat on the back for a job well done. But God does promise us that if we will wait patiently on Him, that after many days we will find our reward. We will reap our harvest, and the reward will far exceed our expectations. I close with this. Back in the 1800s, there lived a man in upstate New York by the name of John Chapman. Chapman was a deeply religious man who sought to live by the golden rule. And although Chapman never married, he deeply loved children. And he was very passionate about his career in horticulture. John Chapman wanted to do something to enrich the lives of other people. And so he started planting apple trees throughout upper New York and over into Pennsylvania. And when the rich, fertile land south of the Great Lakes and west of the Mississippi River was opened up to settlers in what was then called the Northwest Territory, John Chapman became one of the first men to explore that new area of our country. And just as he had done back in his home state of New York and in Pennsylvania, John Chapman carried bags of apple seeds with him everywhere he went. And whenever he would find good fertile land, he would cut down trees and clear the land and plant apple seeds. And it is estimated that John Chapman planted several million apple seeds over the course of his lifetime as a service to mankind. In time, large apple orchards grew up in what would later become the states of Ohio and Michigan and Indiana and Illinois. And as settlers moved into these states, they were pleasantly surprised to find an abundance of juicy, delicious apples to make pies and jams and apple cider. All thanks to John Chapman, the man that we have come to know as Johnny Appleseed. What if this year, instead of sowing apple seeds, you and I dedicated our lives to sowing spiritual seeds for the Lord? What if each and every day this year you and I made a conscious effort to sow seeds of God's kindness and love goodness and salvation everywhere we go, into the lives of everyone we meet. Trusting in God for the results and the rewards. Would you make that commitment tonight? Would you make the commitment to be a spiritual seed bearer for the Lord this year? Cast your bread upon the waters, for you will find it after many days. We're going to sing.